Oh, I'm all set with that.
I was gonna say, I thought we had peanut butter.
Okay. Welcome back to Ways and Means. And we're gonna continue our discussion.
Aaron, could you make our screen disappear? That'd be great.
Distracting.
Vice Chair, is it okay with you if I keep eating?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Take on that nourishment. Do some heavy lifting. Okay, so,
Back, thanks for living. So, we're gonna try to do this afternoon, hopefully, is go through the homestead exemption. One that we talked about yesterday. We had a presentation from Julia, from JFO yesterday on the proposal, the financial implications and some questions. And then we also have a presentation from Beth St. James from Ledge Council on some language that she's going to share with us that's been developed to include in H454. And then we might hear from Kirby Keaton, but we're not sure about that yet, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the questions on the homestead exemption, I put them together based on our discussion yesterday, which is one, I'm going to read through all of them and get back to them. Do we prefer the proposed homestead exemption over the current property tax credit and over the governor's proposal? That's question number one. Question number two is what income limits are appropriate? Is there anything significant about $115,000? Number three, should we establish a cap on the amount of the homestead exemption if that's the one that we choose? If so, should that be 400,000, 500,000? Or what dollar amount? Four, how do we pay for the homestead exemption? By raising overall property taxes or through some other source? Is there a way to limit the amount of the exemption to what the property tax credit is now in terms of dollar amount, $153 million? Five, if we adopt this new exemption, how are we going to make a transition to the new plan? So as we talk about the homestead exemption, that's what we kind of identified yesterday as the questions. I don't know, I'm assuming those are all the ones you really need to decide. We already have it in some language and statute, which was drafted by John Gray, Ledge Council, and we have all the numbers from JFO through Julie Richter. So the first question, do we prefer the proposed homestead exemption, which is looking at that $5,000 steps, or it's $10,000 steps, but broken out to show $5,000 all the way up to $115,000, starting at what, 95% from $0 to $25,000, and I'm going all the way to $0 at $115,000. That's the homestead exemption part, as opposed to what our current property tax credit is now. And we've spent a lot of time talking about that property tax credit and how that's configured. And then we had the governor's proposal that was presented to us by Jake Feldman from Tax. And we spent some time looking at that, which was the kickoff point for what JFO developed as an alternative, because we were missing some of those. There were more, that was when we were dealing with red and green in the grid instead of white spots. Yeah. And red was those people who got less of a credit or had to pay more, and green was those who had similar or more of a credit. So are we prepared to talk about which format you prefer? It's a big one.
My preference is to get away from the existing system we have, simply because I think it's very complex and it's very cumbersome and people don't understand it, lag and those kinds of reasons. So I would like to go to something that's simpler. And to me, it sounded like an exemption off of the value of your home was a simpler way to, number one, administer and to understand and to affect your actual year's taxes, as opposed to figuring out what happened last year.
Right.
However, well, okay, so I like that. I'm not, crazy about extending it so far that we exceed the 153 million that we already produce in property tax exemptions. So that's a big chunk on the ed fund when we take that line out. When we talked about adding another 35 or 45 or whatever those numbers were of additional amount, I mean, maybe it's not much money in comparison to the whole thing. But I would be curious about trying to hold it to 150 million as an example, rather than extending it out even further, which means, you know, Julia would have to do some other remodeling to figure out whether you're changing the income category or the exemption category.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I also, no, you're good. I also think that eliminating the gap year is a huge priority, the lag. I think that, you know, at its base, even without the lag, we have a very complicated system right now with that lag. Feels like fake numbers at a certain point, right? I think some criticisms of the homestead exemption that I've heard that resonate with me are, you know, folks who are living in homes that are multi-million-dollar homes, but have very low income on paper. You know, that money is somewhere, even if it's not in your AGI. And so allowing somebody living in a multi-million-dollar home to exempt big chunks of that because they on paper have a low income, that's a red flag that I have. And I also have, this is an extremely minor detail, but on the draft 1.1 proposal, the $47,000 to $50,000, that little $3,000 income chunk. So from under draft 1.1, 25,000 to 47,000, 90% exemption. From 47,000 to 50,000, 80% exemption. And then from 50 to 60, 70. So that $3,000 being, you know, disproportionately, I just feel like that $3,000 should either be lumped below 50K or above 50K. And that I feel like is more of a design tweak than an overall criticism of the proposal, but those are some of my initial thoughts to it. Overall, I like the idea of moving towards a homestead exemption. And I'm still concerned about the little white L, but we've heard testimony about how complicated it would be to get that. So those are some of my thoughts.
So far, exemption is preferred over property tax credit.
Is there any thought of having the exemption amount different based on the school district? So that would respond to the differing fair market values across the state. And I might be wrong.
Except that the property tax is figured on your equalized value.
No, but the point being that real estate and part of the state is vastly much more expensive. So you might have a lower income and be living in a $500,000 or $600,000 house in part of the state, whereas that same income might tend to live in a $300,000 house in a different part of the state. Because market values are just so much higher.
Market values are different. Not about ceiling, just market values are different. And I was thinking, we do this without something strange. And I thought, well, what if we overlaid it into the district itself? The new district, you know, that their market values are there.
I think you're gonna run into the Brigham decision or Brigham problems for that, just off the top of my head, but I don't know, we could probably consult with JFO and council about it.
Well, it's about how people are helped who are paying their taxes, not about the total amount collected going to schools. And it just says, okay, we won't try to figure out if it should go to 500, which would exempt so much in another part of the state, might exempt the entire house. And yet, in another part of the state, it's only half the house.
Representative Higgins.
So I agree with Representative Feldes. I certainly think we should be going with the exemption. That's one consideration, right? The property tax credit now that we use or an exemption, correct?
Yeah.
So I agree with the exemption. I still am not hundred percent clear on the difference in the amount that would be added to what we currently have for exemptions for going to the $400,000 equalized house site value group. So maybe if Julia or somebody could go through that scenario once real quick with me, whether, I know 500,000, I think was 35 million. But what was the 400,000? Is, that, those ranges?
That was 45 million.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I may be wrong. It's the other way around. Yeah. Should we ask, could you join us?
Up there?
Yeah, that'd be great. And maybe pull up that slideshow, the
Yes.
slide deck you had yesterday. That might be the most helpful. If we can just see the numbers.
Sure. Erin, would you send me the Zoom link? The one from this morning from Sorcha? I'm just gonna join the Zoom. I'm Julia Richter, JFO. I am going to join the Zoom.
Suiting. Are we thinking that this is a permanent change? Like this will be permanent architecture moving forward under the new education transformation? Okay. So we are.
Not a temporary thing, but replacing the property transfer credit as property tax credit as we know it with a different approach.
And we are settled as a committee on the idea that the property tax credit is the best way to treat this problem.
That's a separate question that we should probably look at.
I'm not convinced it is anymore.
Can you say that?
What are you thinking?
I mean, I remember door knocking. I met a guy who had a house that a couple years ago was 200,000. People bought land around him, put up mansions. His house is well over $500,000 now. And he said, they're complaining because they need people to fix their 11 bathrooms, but we can't live here anymore. And what I worry is that the factor for him is not his house value, it's the ability to pay as well. And I remember being a real skeptic about an income-based approach to education funding. Like I was solidly against it because of the instability. And then Deb Brighton worked on me hard. And I don't know, I feel like we're building more and more infrastructure and more complexity, but we're dealing with fewer and fewer people and more money. And what I worry about is, we just spent 120 million to buy down the tax rate. Now we have a 45 million expenditure to help the same income brackets we were trying to help before. I just wonder if at some point we also need to just say, is this the right way to do this? Just gonna say that.
Yeah, and if we're thinking about trying to move to a totally different way to pay for education, you're right. What we're looking at is just using the existing system to pay for education, not for property taxes, and looking at giving relief to taxpayers based on their income.
But we're moving the shells around, but we're not actually changing the
Doesn't
cost. And
change
it
it.
doesn't, like when we pay, we're gonna pay more to help a smaller group of people and, they need help. I'm not saying they don't need help. But I just wonder if there's a more efficient way to achieve this and that speaks, I had people in tears who were in tears because of the way the trade-off is dropping. It used to be 138 to make it make sense to get the credit. Now it's 115. I don't even know what those people are going to think this year. That guy on Beaver Meadow Road, he didn't ask for his house property to triple in value because someone read an article in the New York Times and decided ours was the town to live in. And I don't know, it's just hard. And, it is an asset.
Julia.
Okay, so I'm in the Zoom. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen to the presentation from yesterday.
Yes.
Okay, so, I believe, Red Pigley, you are hoping I could talk through what the expanded, when we're talking about the 45 million and the 35 million, what we're talking about and what those numbers correspond with, is that correct?
Please.
Okay, so bear with me, I'm gonna scroll down to
And just if I can, and maybe this is in response to Teddy's question in regards to, should we be looking at, maybe it doesn't matter. But the more granular look at them all, or does it matter?
I think that, so this slide deck, it's on the committee page under my name from yesterday. I'll send it to Erin to post again today. Oh, she's reposting it. Perfect. Both are included in there. The more granular look at the model is going to allow you to better understand within by household income and by house site value, how different groups would be impacted by this proposal. So from my perspective, yes, it's more numbers, and also with more numbers comes more information, right? So there's more information included there. The homestead exemption so starting out with what's in front of you in draft 1.1 is the homestead exemption with no cap on house site value, right? So that's saying if you have an income that would make you eligible for the homestead exemption, regardless of your house site value, you can use the exemption on your entire house site value. So if you have, looking at the structure, you know, if you have a household income of 50,000, regardless of your house site value, 70% of it will be exempt for the property tax. Full stop. That's what draft 1.1 has included in it. There is no cap or limit like we're talking about. So because it is the most of the three different iterations that I presented yesterday, the most expansive homestead exemption, it is the highest cost, right? Because it's the most exemption. So that's where the 45 million more than current law comes into play. And essentially what this is saying is, you'll recall that all of the changes is comparing to current law, all else equal, right? In current law, we have the property tax credit that's somewhere around 150 million. So when looking at this proposal, the homestead exemption as included in draft 1.1 would cost 45 million more than the current property tax credit. Another way to think about that is that's 45 million less that's not being collected from the households that are eligible. Because we're not collecting that 45 million in revenue from property tax from those households that are eligible, it needs to be raised somewhere else, or the ed fund is short. So that's level setting when we're thinking about the 45 million. Then the next pieces that we looked at, which are later on in the slide deck, and Rep. Kimball mentioned this in the list of questions, is, do you want to say that if you fall into one of these household groups, you can apply this percentage exemption against your entire house site value regardless of how much it is? So if you have a house site value of $1 million, and you have 50,000 in income, should you be able to exempt 70% of your $1 million house site? Or should you be able to exempt a certain portion of that $1 million house site, and then everything above that certain portion you pay full tax on? It's not exempted. And so that gets into that house site limit that we're talking about. By introducing that, you're reducing the exemption, right? Because instead of applying, I'm using a million because it's round, no other reason. But in the $1 million example, if you have a limit and you say, you know, the exemption is going to apply for the first 400,000 of property value, 500,000, whatever. okay, everything above that limit, that 400, that 500 is full tax. That means that you are taking more property tax from those households, which in turn means there's a less of a cost of the exemption because you have less foregone revenue. So what we're looking at here in the slides, I'm on slide 16, to this granular piece, this is looking at draft 1.1 with no limit. And what we're looking at here is the households that would see a decrease on average in their property tax bill versus an increase in their property tax bill. If it's blue, it would be a decrease by the corresponding amount in the cell. If it's white, it would be an average increase. Of course, these are all averages, all estimates. So that's what the proposal looks like. To the conversation that has been, or I guess I'll continue in this vein, and then I think there's one other helpful thing to say, but I'm gonna put a pin in it. Scroll down more to continue talking about the house site limit, right? So now we're saying, okay, instead of exempting 70% or 20% or whatever it is of the full $1 million house site, we're gonna say first 400,000, you have that exemption applied against it, right? The 70% exemption applies to the first 400,000. Any property value you have above 400,000 is going to be fully taxed. And so in this case, the estimate is that instead of it costing 45 million, where there's no limit, by introducing a limit up to 400,000 that qualifies for the exemption, then the cost is 35 million more rather than 45 million more, which makes sense, right? Because we're pulling in more revenue from the properties that have house sites over 400,000. The house site values over 400,000, if they qualify by income, still get an exemption. The exemption is just not as much as it would be without a limit. 500,000 is the same intuition, but you're not limiting it as much. You're saying exemption on the first 500,000, anything above that is going to be taxed at full value. So that's what we're talking about with respect to the limits. It's fair to assume that just in terms of intuition, right, the lower the limit, the lower the cost, because the exemption is going to be less expansive. The higher the limit, the higher the cost, because the exemption is going to be more expansive, right? You're going to be exempting more property. I think one other piece that is helpful to keep in mind here is when talking about the cost of the exemption compared to current law, right? 45 million, 35 million, whatever iteration we're looking at. In reducing the cost of the exemption is going to be essentially it's going to be expanding the property tax from certain households, right? Because the 45 million cost, it's a cost because you're taking 45 million less from property taxpayers that are eligible. If you say, we want this to be revenue neutral, like the tax department's proposal, where it costs the same as under current law, then you will see more white squares than blue squares or more zeros, no change. So that's just the policy choice. Who are you drawing the revenues from? And then the later, it's tangential and it's all connected, but then the question is, if you do want to expand income sensitivity in a way, switch to the house site exemption, say, no cap, 45 million, because that's the cost that we've spoken about the most here. Then the question is 45 million from where? property taxes, non-homestead, homestead, and depending on where that 45 million falls, then it would impact your blue, who's white, because you may be, because if you are raising the 45 million or the 35 or whatever on the homestead property tax, then you are going to be raising the tax rate for all of the folks who qualify, because the way that the homestead exemption works is everybody is paying the property tax.
Representative Flanagan.
So maybe I'm not understanding this correctly, but wouldn't we then not be using the money that we're spending now on income sensitivity? It's something like 150 million.
Yeah, that's correct. So essentially the way to think about it is under current law, we're spending about 150 million on income sensitivity. If the draft 1.1 as drafted were to go into effect, current law property tax credit would completely be gone away with. It would no longer exist, and a new system would be put in its stead, this homestead exemption, which instead of costing 150 million, would cost about 195 million. So we're talking about a difference in the cost of 45 million.
I see, that's where we're getting. Okay. No wonder you're so concerned about that.
I wouldn't say concern, just making you aware.
So, I mean, initially, I think I would advocate for the lower limit, maybe 400,000. But isn't there also a scenario that we need to consider or look at in regards to that maximum amount, whether it's 115,000 or the 135,000? I mean, that's gonna adjust things as well. And did we have any slides on that or no?
No, you haven't had any slides on that. In terms, so are you talking about making the structure so, you said that with including a limit. So for instance, this,
Right.
you're talking about instead of it going up to 115, it going up to a different number.
Right, because if it did, then of course it'd be well over the 35 million.
Correct. So the more that you expand the homestead exemption, the more costly the exemption is going to be, unless you also change the house site exemption percentages. Right? So you're talking, this slide is getting at three buckets of levers. One lever is household income groups that are applicable for the homestead exemption. Bucket two is by those income groups, what house site exemption percentage are they eligible for? And then bucket three is how much property value, house site property value is that exemption applied against until they need to pay full freight.
I mean, and again, maybe just for discussion, I'd start off, I guess, leaving it currently as it is on this particular page, the $115,000 house site income group max, and the maximum exemption of the 400,000. And again, that's just to start off the discussion. I mean, in my area, there's not, I don't think there's any $400,000 house sites. And there's not very many $15,000 incomes either. So I guess, I'm just looking at, what the household income group would, and again, it's a maximum exemption of the, if they only have how would that, they only had a $250,000 house site, it'd still be that, let's say they were making 50,000 in that range, it would still be 70% of that $250,000.
Yeah, so if the choice were, if you were to say you wanted to further lower the house site cap, but keep these the same, we would see the maximum exemption change to 250,000.
No, but I'm just saying, that's the maximum, so I'm just saying, if they didn't reach the
Oh,
max.
under this structure.
Yeah,
If if I had a household income of 50,000 and my house site value was 225,000, then for the full house site value, I would be able to apply 70%.
Okay.
It's up to 400,000. If my house site value was 500,000 and I still made a income of 50,000, then I would say, okay, 70% against the first 400,000 of my house site. And then the next 100 would be no exemption.
Okay. And again, just for, discussion point, that's where I'd start.
Representative Odie.
So I would like to know where these benefits go geographically. And I would have to just say, if income is higher in some places than in other places in the state, and if property values are higher in some places than other places in the state, then having just one exemption amount on the real property and one on the house site and one exemption and one income level is going to benefit people around the state very differently, I think. That would just be my intuition. And so how do we solve that? And, one is to link to an area. And another is to say, where are these benefits going geographically? And say, is that what we need? Is that what we intend?
So I am not prepared to speak to where the benefits are going geographically. I would have to do modeling that I haven't done for that, so I can't answer that question. I guess the only piece of your question that I know, and I'm going to say it because I think it's helpful to be said out loud, is that with respect to the house site value, the maximum exemption is going to be, as is currently structured, would be the same across the entire state. So if you have an area where most house site values are 500,000 and another area where most house site values are 100,000, the area with 100,000 house site values, all of it would be applicable for the exemption. The area with the 500,000 house site values, the first 400. So,
And if you have $800,000 for a regular old house anymore in some areas, then only 400 comes off. And now where do they end up on chart, especially considering that the income might be higher than that?
So, yeah, I think there'd be a couple of different ways to look at geographic distribution. I mean, one is the geographic distribution across the state, right? And then two is, yes, the house site values on average across the state. And as is currently structured, if you qualify for an exemption, you can use that in this instance, you can use that, everyone can use that exemption up to 400,000, regardless of the average house site value in the area. And these are all policy choices,
Right.
that I cannot speak to.
Thank you. John.
Representative
I know
Hochul.
I'm gonna be the skunk at the party again.
I feel like I was.
And I think this committee voted to lower tax rates this year by 120 million. We have no plan on the table to bring down costs in the ed fund. And so that means the next year, we're gonna get a bounce already right out of the gate. And the same people who are gonna be paying for that bounce are gonna be some of the people who are eligible, but also a lot of people who aren't eligible. So I'm thinking of, again, the family who earns $116,000 a year as a combined income in their household, and their property value tripled or whatever it did. And now they're looking right out of the gate, level funding on their budgets, they're looking at 12 plus, maybe 15-cent increase in their tax rate. So, I mean, how do we handle that? How do we do that to people? Again,
So How does that work with the current?
Well, if we do this, this will increase the tax rate on everybody who's not eligible. It'll increase it on them because it's a little self-funding, but it will increase the tax rate on everybody else in the ed fund, won't it?
If the idea is to raise the additional cost
Yeah.
on homestead property tax, yes.
That's true.
Which we know they need, and we also are gonna increase the tax on everybody else because we bought it down, so we're gonna have that balance. I would feel a lot more comfortable on this, and I'm gonna say it again until I'm blue in the face, if we started taking some of the non-K-12 stuff out of the ed fund. Because we keep adding cost, when are we gonna take some stuff out? The problem here is affordability. And when are we gonna bring down the cost to people in the ed fund? And I support this, but we're trying to treat the problem by making the problem. We're not addressing the fact that we're trying to figure out how to educate, and I know it's gonna take time. But we have put new things into the ed fund. We're gonna get a bill from the Senate that's gonna put significant burdens on the ed fund if it passes. When are we gonna say we're gonna stop driving up property taxes until we figure this out? We have to figure this out. Complicated.
Representative Brannigan.
Beth is right on that, you know. We should absolutely do that.
We gotta take something else out.
Pre-K 12 is our group we want to protect. Everything else is expendable. Expendable.
I would say, and I don't know, you can tell me if you agree or disagree with this, but you have two choices. If you're focusing on K to 12, you have two choices, I think. And one is to have a revenue stream that is not in the ed fund now, diverted to the ed fund, like increasing the amount of meals and rooms tax revenue from the general fund to the ed fund in recognition of the fact that property taxpayers never signed up to pay for, those things that are in the ed fund don't belong there. Or take them out and make them general fund obligations. Those are options that we have in front of us. I mean, unless you want to raise a new revenue source, which,
Given that we're going into what we're going into on the federal level, we also need to
Yeah.
maintain some capacity.
yes,
For the things,
absolutely.
the things that we know are coming, but we haven't yet figured out.
That is always a reason, unless you're in a recession, very difficult economic times, or this, what might come at us from the federal government. You cannot tax to your capacity in every single area, like adding all new taxes. You've got to keep that ability to raise taxes to run this state in bad times. So I would not think that's what we should do.
Representative Wazazzi.
I see Charlie trying to reel us back into the questions. But again, per the last time I said this phrase, I got myself in trouble, but I feel the need to say this, that we bought down the education fund with $77 million. And if we,
120, because.
yes, the surplus, I'm focusing just purely on that 77. If we reinstated the top tax bracket for those making over $500,000 in income a year, which was taken out during the Shumlin administration, that would raise $78 million a year. Now,
Okay, so, but aside from that, so those are some big questions that, what do we have in front of us? We have Julia in front of us to answer questions specifically upon this.
oh yeah, Julie's here.
Right, and to really answer questions that we might have about the different options that are before us in the proposed legislation. We could, if we're all done with questions for Julia, we can move on and then hash out the rest of it. But people have more questions for Julia.
Representative Brannigan.
Is it possible for us to ask Julia to come up with an outlook sheet with only pre-K to 12 outflows?
Well, what is pre-K to 12 though? We have to say that for.
We don't agree.
Even, I will just say, even if you do ask me, the answer will be, no, I'm not able to do that. And the reasons why are twofold. One, biggest is what counts as pre-K to 12. That is a question that is deliberated often within this state house that I cannot comment on. And then two, it's also a question of data availability. How are school districts booking certain costs in their budgets?
Nice try.
I wish I could be more helpful.
There are.
That's a whole nother topic. we need
It's
to
a whole
move
other
on.
topic, and I think there are things that are not K-12. The problem is it's like a tumor. Once it grows in, it's hard to extract without doing a lot of repair work someplace else.
Yeah, but it can be done.
It can be done, it just takes time.
I know better than anybody else on this table, it can be done.
I know you know. That's why you're here.
So speaking of our agenda,
Is that a subcommittee? Would that take a subcommittee to determine what's?
yeah, in the absence of the Representative Kornheiser, say that that is a bigger question that we could focus on beginning next week or other times, yeah, maybe as a committee or a subcommittee.
Representative Maslin.
Yeah, Carolyn, good question. Rebecca also knows, I mean, this question comes up periodically. And I guess I'd say it would be nice to. Well, several people have said around the table today at the point. What data is available? In many cases, it's like the tumor, it's growing in here and there. First, we try to ask, what specifically are we trying to learn here? What are we trying to solve? And I'm not sure it's the merit of the question generally, but in a broader sense, what's the problem we're trying to solve here with regards to that? That's, I mean, we find out that, I think someone said within the last 24 hours, we find that the cost will differ district to district because of different kind of accounting systems that different school systems use. And then the question is, what do we do with it? And if we're looking at this thing we're working on, with new districts and configurations, stuff like that, then we might ask what specifically you want to know about cost of age group, K-5, 8, or 5 to 12. And for what purpose? All of that's a question in itself. And so I'm not trying to throw wet blanket on what you're gonna learn.
I know, it's okay.
I don't know. Anyway, sorry.
So what other questions do we have for Jeff?
Julia, was there any ideas on adjusting property tax credit to fix the problems that are causing us to jump?
The current law of property tax credit. I guess I guess the first thing I would say is, the problem, that you're trying to solve is a policy choice, right? What is the intent? That being said, I would say, a couple years ago, there was the Income Education Tax Study Committee. Chair Kornheiser was one of the co-chairs of it. And on that, we did a lot of work where we did modeling of changing the property tax credit. And I did do a brief presentation outlining some of the work that we had done at the beginning of the session to this committee, I believe. The study committee identified the problem as trying to get rid of some of the cliffs in the system, as well as trying to make the highest incomes pay more so that there wasn't that regressivity at the tail end of the structure. What we found in the modeling was that there were a number of that squeezing the balloon image, you try to adjust this cliff, and then by lowering that person's bill, then you've got foregone revenue that needs to be raised elsewhere, and all else equal, then that's gonna shift to everybody else who you're not lowering. So they couldn't, at the time, during the study committee, we met all day, over many days, and they didn't identify a way in order to squeeze the balloon in all of the places to address all of the things that they were trying to address. And ended up deciding to not recommend any changes to the current property tax credit structure. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I would encourage you all to review either that report or the slides that I put together. Not trying to say, look at the slides I put together, but the slides I put together.
We want to get rid of this problem, but we're going to replace it with something that's going to cost 35 or 34 or 45 million more.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's a policy choice. What is the problem? What are you trying to solve? If one of the things I've heard around the table is simplicity is a desired outcome versus complexity. Is this more complex? Is this more simple? If so, the pieces that you do not like about this, does that overshadow what you do like about this or not? I mean, if there was a silver bullet, I know we all know this, it would already be done. This, of course, is incredibly challenging work. And so it's a question of priorities. And thinking about, those 6 pillars of a good tax system, we think about the trade-offs between simplicity and fairness, and tax neutrality. There's those pillars, and it's a trade-off.
I want to level set something and then ask you a question. I think part of the reason why we're talking about this now is the governor had proposed a uniform tax rate and then a way to apply property tax credits in a simpler way for primary homeowners. I think that was the initial kind of proposal, and that's why we're here. That's what drove it. But the question that I had for you, Julia, is of the 115, we're just using that really at the top income tax level. That's really because that's where the math turns us out now. So it could be apples to apples comparison versus what we're doing now, right? So there's no real magic to the 115. Is it we use 125 for the child tax credits where we start phasing it out, and there's other things. Is that?
Yeah, those are all policy choices. The 115 is the current break-even point for this fiscal year, at which point it is at 115, household income is always going to be cheaper for a household to pay on property than to pay on income. That's the 115. It's a math exercise that JFO and tax do in consensus every year. The question of should it be something other than 115 is a policy choice. If you were to say to me, yes, we want it to be X, I would say, okay, and how would you want to adjust the exemption structure? How would you want to adjust the percentages? And if you're expanding it, then you are expanding the cost of it. The other piece I would say is the 115, that's a reflection of current law yields. It's are the inputs we put into the equation are the 225 property value and statute and the yields. It's a algebra equation that I could show some of you sometime if you'd be interested. So too, the property tax credit overall cost of 150 million, give or take, that we're comparing against is also a function of current law. The current cost of the property tax credit is a function of the property yield, the income yield, and what you have in statute. So we're comparing against the current law system where there are certain parameters that are laid out in statute and then laid out in session law. So they're not, yeah,
There's one last question for you. On a circuit breaker, which we have right now, 47,000. How is that in here?
so this proposal does away with the entire education fund property tax credit system, including the education fund circuit breaker of 47,000. It doesn't touch the municipal circuit breaker of 47,000. You'll recall that is funded out of the general fund. So we're talking only about education property taxes, income sensitivity here. And this proposal does away with all income sensitivity in current law and replaces it with a homestead exemption that follows the general construct of the administration's, proposal of a homestead exemption, but changes all of the incomes and exemption levels.
So there's still the
Percentage.
47, even if we adopted this, there's still the 47,000 for municipal.
For municipal, correct.
Which should be funded out of the general fund.
That's not contemplated in the legislation, so that would just carry on as it currently lives in the books.
That's not in the ed fund, that's in the general.
Correct.
The maximum value of $2,400. I'm sorry to ask you on the spot.
I would want to ask John.
I think that's right, and I can.
Representative Felkus.
Do we have any thought about how one would actually administer this homestead exemption? One of the concerns I had about the previous system is I think it's relatively complex. People fill out these homestead exemption forms and somebody, tax department, I guess, calculates out what the differences would be, and then they tell the town clerk, and then the town clerk puts that on your tax bill as a deduction. And there's got to be some time and money involved in doing all that stuff. If you had an exemption, what would we do? The homeowner just attests my income is this and I get 70% off and, here you go? Or how would we do that?
Good as tax.
Yeah, so I would defer to tax for the administration. A lot of those administration questions, the homestead exemption proposal was a proposal from the tax department originally. And they do have a report and included in the report, which I can share back around, includes some of those considerations. The one piece that I would say with respect to the income question of attesting to income, under current law, you have the household declaration form. If you're eligible, then you fill out your household income information. And one of it necessitates to look back so that you actually know what your income is, right? You don't know what your income is going to be in the coming year. So as this is currently structured, it would still maintain that look back to the prior year's income for the coming year's exemption.
Oh,
So it would say, our household income was X in the prior year, which means that for our upcoming property tax bill, we get X% exempt.
Representative Odie.
Would it be the time for me to ask if you could model what a variable exemption would look like in terms of cost by new subunits of governance?
I don't understand the question.
Well, once we know what the governance districts will look like, can we see how, based on cost of living, probably not, maybe not cost of living, but certainly based on income and based on house site value, what it would look like to have varying house site exemptions and varying income qualifications.
So I would say, I'm not aware of district boundaries that the bill considers.
Yes, so maybe we could even just see it by county. I mean, I'm asking you, I should ask, I don't know what to, this is very big deal. Very big,
But she's the witness.
yeah.
Questions should
So
go.
can it be done if you did it by county, for example? For us, even though we.
I guess, what I'm struggling to understand is, I understand there's interest in geography. I don't understand what the proposal would look like. For me to model something, I need very clear guidance of this is how this would be adjusted in all of these ways. And then perhaps, depending on all of the ways, I can work on it. But I need very specific parameters.
Future consideration, but we certainly don't have the data that.
And I would just say, I think going back to the simplicity thing, I think I was just looking again at some of the ratios. There are districts that have staffing levels half of year, twice years, and we have some issues here. And I think, to me, the lesson is we really need to start bearing down on some of those issues. What I don't want to do is make something more complicated. What I do want to highlight is everything we've done has increased the tax burden on people next year, most people. This will buy them out of it a little bit for some people, but we do need to be thinking about how we allocate our resources and where are the places that we can encourage people. I didn't, none of this, we can do whatever we want in this committee, it's not going to address the problem. It's going to.
I get that there's a big underlying problem, I totally do. And when I heard Representative Higley saying, well, 400,000, I don't know if there's, I'll misquote you, anybody who's got a house side worth more than 400,000, maybe in your area, and who makes over 50,000 in your area, well, I have a different situation in my area. So if there's so much help going, and I'm not arguing that people shouldn't get help, but how do I ensure that other groups of people in where their incomes might be higher and their house sites are higher, out of their control, because where they have to live, now they don't fit into, they're going to get the same kind of help, because how else to put this?
It's less health issue, it's more like I worry about like who is in that band. That's two medical technicians or a PA. I mean, it's what we have to be careful about is who is bearing the brunt of this. And there are also going to be people near jobs. We talked a lot about land value tax in a paradoxical way. Our education fund is functioning a little bit like a land value tax. If you're in an area with very low housing values, because you're not a place a lot of people are trying to live right now. If you're in an area with very high values, it's because that land is seen as very valuable, probably because people are trying to live near their jobs or something. I don't know. But the issue is how do we make sure the people who are working in the state, how do we make sure they can live there?
Yeah,
That's a real issue.
and that's what
I
guess that's what I'm trying to get at. What are they supposed to do when this is not going to help them to make it their lives as affordable as they could be? I guess maybe then you could go to, if you expand it, the help, and it goes more than 45 million, then where could you get, besides the non-homestead and homestead property taxes, where could you get that help? And then there's two places.
What do you got, Jim?
What do I got?
Because you're holding us up from a break.
I'll be brief. I think we're making this far too complicated. The more we try to get JFO to model things that are district specific or various kind of specificities that we can assign to you to figure this out. I say in truth, the further we're getting from the target. We're gonna end up with answers that we can't deal with, we don't like. And the present system, use that as a bad example. With income sensitivity and outside values, stuff like that. Is understandable on its face. And anything we do also needs to be equally understandable to its face, and on its face, and it needs to apply to everybody. All Vermonters, whether they fit in this group and can use it or not is a secondary question, but it needs to be straightforward, understandable, on its face. Do we agree to the basic parameters and where we're going, and then can we use it? So I'm sorry to,
Rain on my parade.
well, really, I was getting more and more confused as to how it would play out. Working out little scenarios in my mind on, will it work this way? Will it work this way? Will it work in Chittenden County? Will it work in Orange County? And end up with it just season crow, so I'm just, that's my, hold me up from your break there.
Line up and
That's
down
right.
together, so.
Okay,